The women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement was a decade-long fight to win the right to vote for women in the United States.
It was not easy to be a suffrage activist. And
It took activists and reformers nearly 100 years to win that right, and the campaign was not easy. Disagreements over strategy threatened to cripple the movement more than once. But on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was finally ratified. The women's rights movement began. Campaign for women's suffrage began in earnest in the decades before the Civil War. During the 1820s and 30s, most states had extended the franchise to all white men, regardless of how much money or property they had. Religious movements, moral reform society, anti-slavery organizations, and in many of these, women played a prominent role. Meanwhile, many American women were beginning to chafe against what historians have called the cult of true womanhood. That is, the idea that the only true woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. Put together, all of these contributed to a new way of thinking about what it meant to be a woman and a citizen of the United States. Civil rights and women's rights during the Civil War. During the 1850s, the women's rights movement gathered steam, but lost momentum when the Civil Rights began. Almost immediately after the war ended, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution raised familiar questions of suffrage and citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, extends the Constitution's protection to all citizens and defines citizens as male. The 15th, ratified in 1870, guarantees black men the right to vote. Some women's suffrage advocates believed that this was their chance to push lawmakers for truly universal suffrage. As a result, they refused to support the 15th Amendment and even allied with racist Southerners who argued that white women's vote could be used to neutralize those cast by African Americans. In 1869, a new group called the National Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They began to fight for a universal suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Progressive Campaign for Suffrage. This animosity eventually faded. In 1890, the two groups merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the organization's first president. By then, the suffragist approach had changed. Instead of arguing that women deserved the same rights and responsibilities as men because women and men were created equal, the new generation of activists argued that women deserved the vote because they were different from men. This argument served many political agendas. Temperance advocates, for instance, wanted women to have the vote because they thought it would mobilize an enormous voting bloc on behalf of their cause. And many middle-class white people were swayed once again by the argument that the enfranchisement of white women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy honestly attained. Winning the vote at last. Starting in the 1910s, some states in the West began to extend the vote to women for the first time in almost 20 years. Idaho and Utah had given women the right to vote at the end of the 19th century. Still, Southern and Eastern states resisted. In 1916, NAWSA President Carrie Chapman Catt unveiled what she called a winning plan to get the vote at last. World War I slowed the suffragist campaign but helped them advance their argument nonetheless. Women's work on behalf of the war effort, activists pointed out, proved that they were just as patriotic and deserving of citizenship as men. Finally, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and on November 2 of that year, more than 8 million women across the United States voted in elections for the first time. Suffrage eventually and finally ended in 1920.